This is part 2 of my conversation with Amos Goldberg. Part 1 is of course already available on the public feeds, and if you want to listen to the full conversation without any interruption, you can head out to patreon.com/fromtheperiphery to find it there. Thank you for listening. In part 2, we start with Professor Goldberg answering this question regarding the warning that he put in that paper. We then discussed an open letter that was released at the end of 2023, in which Holocaust scholars who previously had said that the Holocaust cannot be compared to any other genocide seemed more than willing to compare Hamas to the Nazis and to compare the October 7th massacre to the Holocaust. We took the opportunity after discussing that letter to talk about the importance of a field like comparative genocide studies and how trying to understand how genocides compare to one another is not the same as relativizing them and diminishing their uniqueness in many ways. If anything, it makes our understanding of genocides much more nuanced and richer. The last bit of that conversation of part 2, we got into the book The Holocaust and the Nakba, which Professor Goldberg edited with Professor Bashir on the importance of recognizing two stories that have come to dominate the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict. The Holocaust, of course, and the Nakba. And here's the episode. Because you in the paper, there's a warning that you make effectively. And here I'll quote parts of what you said, that at the question of this forum lies the question of whether the field of Holocaust and Genocide Studies is currently in crisis in light of the events in Gaza. And then you make the argument that, like, if the question of intent, and here I'm quoting, the dominance of which is rooted in legal discourse, we've talked about this in this chat so far, takes over Holocaust and Genocide Studies, then it will push us back decades. And you mentioned that in the context of Gaza and the broader Israeli-Palestinian context, the historical seems to be collapsing into the legal, which, we've gotten into this already. But what I'm curious is, this was published in October of last year, 2024. Is it fair to say that as far as like Holocaust and Genocide Studies as a field is concerned, things have gotten worse?
Very difficult to say because we're still, the genocide is still going on. In many ways, it becomes worse, this total starvation that Israel imposes on Gaza. Can't describe these horrific scenes and I don't know, viciousness. I don't know how, in sadism that is expressed in this. So we don't know. We are still in the event, and academic fields develop even now when everything is online and rapid, but it doesn't catch the pace of the event. So we have to. Right. I think this Gaza genocide. I mean, again, which started with the atrocities of the 7th of October and the Gaza genocide, particularly both sides, but I don't compare them. I mean, again, we should not level them to the same. But still, it was a foundational event for Israelis, and certainly the genocide, the annihilation. And you said people don't go into details, and that's too bad because there's so many details and so many reports and good media investigations. I can, for example, really recommend some of my friends in the Hebrew University. One of them is Lee Mordechai, who has a very impressive, like a synthesis of all the reports. And yes, there are a lot of details, but we are still in it. And what I'm trying to say, it is what is called an epoch-making event. Well, it will change. It already changes our world. We don't know yet where. It will change, certainly. As a Jewish Israeli, I say it's going to change Jewish history and will haunt Jewish history for decades and centuries maybe to come. It will. So we don't really know exactly how it will impact also this field. I think we don't know. We don't have I really recommend reading some of the essays in this forum, as I said, that reflect on where it can take, maybe a kind of a chasm within the field. I hope it will now integrate the Israeli-Palestinian case into this field, I would say, quote unquote, naturally now, but we don't really know. So I can't really answer your question. It's too soon. Academic fields develop much slower and post factum, not only, and we don't have still a distance to talk about it and to understand. At least I can say anything intelligent on this.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. I think it's just fair to say that there is the crisis as you described it, and I suppose we're still in it. And one of the examples, I suppose, that point to there being such a crisis, you mentioned in the paper this open letter by historians in the New York Review of Books from December 2023, comparing Hamas's massacre of October 7th to the Holocaust. And you pointed out that some of these scholars that have signed that open letter have previously argued, and here I'm quoting you, that the Holocaust is unique and must not be compared to any other event, end quote. And the way I've interpreted such letters, we've seen a few of them since along those lines, if not open letters, at least like interventions in various platforms and so on, um, is that many people have been willing to compromise on a lot of what they previously believed in. I mean, I don't know what's on their minds, but at least what they've publicly declared to believe in, to defend or downplay Israel's actions in Gaza. And the irony here, and you point this out yourself, is that you are in the field of comparative Holocaust studies and comparative like genocide studies, rather. And you've always argued that comparing the Holocaust to other genocide is not the same as relativizing and therefore downplaying the severity of the Holocaust. And yet it was those who did argue that it's unique and it cannot be compared to anything else, who have since October 2023 seemingly been willing to make an exception for the first time, apparently, or seemingly, to say that effectively Israel is fighting the new Nazis, as something along those lines. I don't even have a question here. I'm just curious about your reflections on that.
Look, I think we can analyze it on or unpack it on two different levels. On the academic level, I think it's a good question that the Gaza genocide will bring, or the whole this. I mean, since the events of the 7th of October and the Gaza genocide will bring is the issue of analogies, because we can't do without them. But analogies are always weak. And so, what is and it's also in philosophy. I mean, when in philosophy of rhetoric, when they analyze the analogy, we always do analogy. We can't actually, as we can't think outside of analogies, because language is in a way analogical. But analogies, on the one hand, is a very important, tool. But then it's weak because two events or two whatever you analogize to or compare to, or you always compare different things, and you say look, the similarities are enough to draw analogies from one to the other, but the opponent would say no. Yeah, I can, even if I can recognize some kind of similarity, the differences are much more important, and therefore you cannot compare or you cannot make analogy. I should also say that analogies are always, there is some kind of, I would say, a moral problematic in analogizing, because you somehow dilute the uniqueness of each event and its extreme or even total, particularly of such huge suffering, its particular and total totality of these events. You somehow and so we have to how to go along with all those. When I'm talking about uniqueness of the event, I'm not talking about the uniqueness of the Holocaust. I'm talking about the uniqueness of each event and the totality of each event, particularly of mass violence, and the suffering of each group and every individual is something that should not be like reduced to analogy, but should be looked at. So we should look at Gaza and see what is happening in Gaza, and not trying to say, yeah, there is an analogy or not. We just have to look at the atrocities of Gaza and acknowledge them in one way. So I think the whole issue of analogy is coming now to the fore, and what is a valid analogy and what is not. And there's no balance. You can say you don't have to negate one analogy and then have to negate all analogies. No, some analogies are good and some analogies are bad, and we have to debate them and to discuss them, and this is in the public sphere and the academic public sphere and the public sphere per se. So this is on one level. On the other hand, and I will get back to this letter you mentioned. On the other level, public opinion, or not public discourse and colloquial. Oh, we always make analogies in our daily life and in our experiences. And many Israelis really, I think, authentically, because the Holocaust is so present in our consciousness, in the first instance of this, as I say, traumatic blow, that was the historical metaphor ready for use, and we used it. But then I think more than a year and a half, we have to make the distinctions and understand that no, the Hamas are not the Nazis. They cannot compare them whatsoever, because they are not killing us because we are Jews. We are killing us because we are occupiers. There are real political war between us on this land, and within, as I said, settler colonial context, or not the only context, but one of the contexts. Yes, of course, after the apartheid, the siege, the ongoing Nakba, and now what do you want? I mean, they fight, and sometimes they fight in a dirty way and commit crimes, even crimes against humanity, but this doesn't make them the Nazis, and they are also not they are not this superpower that Nazi Germany was. They are, it's one of the most crowded and poorest small places on planet Earth. So it's a wrong analogy. It's a foolish analogy. It's a propaganda analogy. That doesn't mean that any analogy, which much more precise, could be yes, should be used, and because this is how we think. When we think of genocide, we think of a family of crimes or family of events or processes or political happenings that have something in common. That means that you can make some analogy between them. That's the nature of this concept. Now, because they said they are anti-Semitic. They are they were they are undoubtedly, certainly in the 1988 charter of the Hamas, clearly anti-Semitic in some of its paragraphs, but then came the 2017 document, which is allegedly not. And yes, you can still hear anti-Semitic utterances, but this is not every group that uses anti-Semitic rhetoric are Nazis, and certainly it completely distorts to put the emphasis on that instead of the real fight and the oppression and the apartheid that Israel commits. So some analogies are a complete distortion, but some analogies are very good. And I think, for example, with all the differences, and in my article, April 2014 article that I wrote, it was published in Hebrew and then translated to other languages, including English. I say, yes, it is a genocide. And I explain why it is a genocide with some kind on the level of self-defense, what I explained before, that this is really one of the major causes of genocide. How can we make analogies to other cases within this same group under the term genocide? But I think those scholars are really dishonest, because as you said, they always claim that the Holocaust is unique. But then when it comes to the enemies of Israel, suddenly you can make analogies that they were so cautious. You just compared it to, but if you, God forbid, compare or even hint to some kind of connection, even by a moral connection, not a historical connection, between the Holocaust and what is happening in Gaza, then you are a Holocaust denier, you are an anti-Semite. I'll give you an example, very briefly. In March 2022, Blinken came to the Holocaust Museum in Washington in order to declare there, and the museum hosted him, and he said, I came here particularly to declare that we acknowledge what is happening in Myanmar as a genocide. So this association was maybe association was completely legitimate, and it somehow bestowed some kind of moral authority on what he said, because he said it in the Holocaust Museum. But if you dare say, look, I want to come to Yad Vashem or to any other museum and declare that we acknowledge the Gaza genocide, oh my God, you cannot, this is beyond our imagination, something like that happening. Maybe, if we go back, I hope it might happen in 5-10 years' time, when they, at least partially and in certain places, when really the Gaza genocide will integrate into this field of Holocaust and Genocide Studies.
So you co-edited a book called The Holocaust and the Nakba, as you mentioned, A New Grammar of Trauma and History with Bashir Bashir, notably also forwarded by the unfortunately late Lebanese intellectual Ilyas Khouri. I believe in the foreword, in the introduction, I don't remember where, but in the book, there is a passage from his novel, Bab al-Shams, Gate of the Sun. And so there's a two-part to this, two questions, I guess, and I'll ask the first one and then we'll get to the second one. So in that story, the narrator warns, and here I'm quoting from the story from the book, we mustn't see ourselves, he's talking about we, the Palestinians, mustn't see ourselves only in their mirrors. For they, the Zionists, they are prisoners of one story, as though the story had abbreviated and ossified them. Please, we mustn't become just one story. Believe me, this is the only way if we're not to become ossified and die, end quote. I've done already a few episodes on, let's say, the Palestinian story. Let's call it the Palestinian story on this podcast. And I'll mention the one with Daniel Kurd, my friend and colleague, episode 137 for listeners, called Remembering the Nakba, Imagining the Future. So we won't get into that specific bit as much now, but I am wondering, how would you assess the Israeli story in terms of ossification, or whatever you might say? We've clearly seen, and certainly listeners of this podcast would have a lot of examples by now of Israelis being very willing, seemingly, to dehumanize Palestinians and become what James Baldwin, because this is the podcast named after one of his books, what he called moral monsters. Again, a recurring theme on this podcast. I even saw a video of IDF soldiers. I posted this on Blue Sky, and a lot of people saw it. Blowing up a house in Gaza, and with blue smoke coloring coming out of that, of the fumes of that explosion, because it was a gender reveal party. And they were like laughing and all of that stuff. And there are so many examples of that truly shock people watching them, understandably so. As a historian who looks at these things really to various extent, you've intervened in the public domain, of course, a number of times. But how would you assess Israeli politics today based on your own readings of history as well?
Well, again, all what you mentioned is true, and it's a source. When you look at those things, and they're all documented, and Al Jazeera made a documentary out of them, and so we have to not only, we see the atrocities. First of all, what we see in Gaza is the victims, the suffering of the victims, and unbearable scenes that come every day out of Gaza and the reports. But then we also have the Israeli soldier side, which is not only a source of shock, but also a sort of shame, big shame. How did we become those monsters, or those? For me as an Israeli, I don't dissociate myself from this society. I am part of this society, and there's nothing to say. How did we become so? Well, I knew. You call this process of denial and dehumanization started long ago. It didn't start, but it escalated and reached such monstrous peaks in this war and genocide. And for example, if you just see, there was recently a documentary released on Shireen Abu Akleh, and I don't know if you remember. She was killed. But no, if you remember her funeral, the coffin almost fell because they were so aggressive. I couldn't, and then you can see, what kind of dehumanization? And now it's like, it's a light thing compared to what we say and what you just mentioned. And I don't know how to explain it yet, beyond the obvious explanation that in order to kill so many people, you have to dehumanize them, because if you feel, or to annihilate a whole place, or to commit such a genocide, how can you bomb a hospital if you think human beings are there? So you have to somehow either justify retroactively, or to explain, to justify in advance. And the bigger the crime are, and the more continuous, the more you need to dehumanize, because otherwise you cannot. How can you live with this? And but I think I published some. I don't read good enough Arabic I didn't read Ilyas Khouri's books and novels I think I read most of them either in English or in Hebrew, because many of them were translated to Hebrew.
Yeah.
The recent ones by a beautiful project, a binational project of translating Arab literature to Hebrew, but binationally, of groups of Palestinians and Israelis working together under really the great intellectual of Yehuda Shenav Sha'arabani, who was a very good friend of Elias, Khoury. I also had the chance to meet him twice, I think. And if you read Elias Khoury, this ossification that you stop the movement of life, the movement of narration, the movement of narrative changing, you ossify, it's like an internal death. So this is something that comes again and again. You look for, and it's a kind of, I would say, for those who know, a kind of a Lacanian metonym that you won't move from one signifier to another in order to create your object, to pursue your object of desire and shape your identity. So he warned against that, and unfortunately, Israel is really ossified its to such in a such dehumanizing way, its own dichotomizing completely. We are the sons of light and they are the sons of death. They like death, we like life, all those propaganda, and they ossified and simplified in the most brutal way our collective narrative. And but I should say that I sense a change now in Jewish Israeli society. Things start to change because of the hostages, but not only because of the hostages. We understand that something went wrong or something, and we start reflecting internally on what we actually committed in Israel. And it's not, of course, the forces of denial are very strong, but and I hope that through this major trauma and atrocities and crimes and genocide, maybe it will break some, and like in few years' time, I'm not talking about the Palestinians. I don't know how the Palestinians will. I'm not a Palestinian. I have many Palestinian friends and colleagues, but I can't talk for them. I can talk for the Israelis. Maybe something for the long run will change and really pull us out of this dehumanizing ossification, because it reduces also us to such, I would say, poor and human beings. And I hope this major crisis that we are facing and experiencing might change course in opening, in a way, though in such a violent and genocidal way, ways to new way to tell our stories in a more humane, more duological, more political, more egalitarian way. And I don't say that it will happen, but I see pockets of where it happens, small pockets where these discussions take place. It's not a source of optimism, not at all. But you see change. At least we are not completely ossified. Maybe we can, whether those forces they are still very weak compared to the very strong forces of, I would say, evil in our society, of sadism, of hyper-nationalism and fascism, and of death, of killing, of revenge, of dehumanization. Those forces are still much more stronger, but you can see pockets of exactly what Elias Khoury was describing or so eloquently in his novels. Maybe they will expand. I see them expanding, not still, as I said, minority, but they are expanding. More and more people come to reflect and rethink the ossified narrative of identity.
Thanks for that. And it's a perfect segue to, it's sort of a open-ended and last question, and we'll see where it leads us. But to also end on a somehow hopeful note. And I do make the distinction between optimism and hope, in the sense that hope is more of a discipline, to quote Gilmore. This book that you co-edited with Bashir, The Holocaust and the Nakba, even before we started recording today, you mentioned how, like, at the time it was received in a very particular and very specific way, but since then its relevance has, if anything, grown more and more importance. Can you talk to us a bit about the book? Because as far as I'm concerned, in any case, it's a pretty unique thing, and hopefully it should be less unique. Like, there should be more and more works along these lines, and I do see pockets of that here and there, but certainly for its time as well, I don't know many that are like that.
Yeah, so yeah, I will gladly. First, I would say that I would say work together, but also friendship that developed, very close friendship with Bashir. who's a political theorist, Palestinian political theorist, it so enriched me over the years. We worked for more than a decade on this project. They wrote articles and edited some books and have many talks about it, and we're still ongoing project. On the personal level, it's a kind of a way to say, okay, I understand, as you said, your ossified, cruel narrative. I want to live a little bit different, and we found a way to think and to keep not only our friendship but our intellectual work ongoing even in this crisis. And I'm grateful and thankful and appreciative of Bashir and learned a lot of him. So, and the idea is, and as you said, like when we came out with the book in Hebrew, which is a different book, we co-edited two books, one in Hebrew and then in English, with very similar names. But when it came out in Hebrew, I think it was 2015 or 16, it made a huge splash, but we got such pushbacks. And then when it also, I mean, very critical, how can you put them together, blah, 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 which is, I understand this reaction because those are not the same events. And for both sides, it's very difficult to put them together for both sides. And Jews usually think it's only their problem. How can you compare or put together or analyze the Holocaust and the Nakba? The Holocaust was the biggest crime in the modern history, and Nakba was a kind of a outcome of in this reductive way, of course, outcome of a war. But for us, it is essential to put them, and then it came out in English in 2018 also. There was a lot of pushback by many. And as I said to Bashir recently, and I told you before we started recording, at that time we were the problem. How dare you? It was also how dare you for the Palestinians? Why do we have to care about the Holocaust? We have enough of our problems that we have to care about the Holocaust. Today, I think, as I say, we're kind of a solution in the sense that with this huge abyss between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, that rivers of blood are streaming inside. How can we talk? And many are trying to find some kind of framework to talk about traumas and atrocities and genocides and ongoing Nakba on the one hand, and the Holocaust and its reverberation in the Israeli society and its ongoing traumas in some way together, and to put together some kind, and not only Israelis, also Jews and non-Jews and Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims in the diaspora, who looked for some kind of historical and theoretical framework to talk about them together, to start some kind of a conversation to bridge those abysses. And I would say two things about it. We said, yeah, of course, there are differences between the events. Even now, when we talk about, we said, the genocide in Gaza and the Holocaust are not the same. There's no Treblinka, and there's no Auschwitz, there's no gas chambers, there's no complete annihilation in the sense of killing each and every Palestinian. So yeah, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the Palestinian, the asymmetries in the power relations, and the Palestinians have really no responsibility whatsoever for the Holocaust, while the Israelis have full responsibility, almost the major part in bearing responsibility for the Nakba, ongoing Nakba, and certainly the genocide now in Gaza. So there are a lot of asymmetries. Nonetheless, we have to put them together because they are so interconnected. And they are interconnected in so many ways. I don't know how can we talk separately about them, because they are connected historically. They happen. It's one historical continuum. They are connected in the minds of people. They are connected. Both are the foundational events, traumatic events of both nations, of the Palestinians and the Israelis, Jews and Jews at large, and maybe beyond that. So I will not repeat this, but they are so interconnected, and our history are interconnected. And in order to, it's not right to talk about separately because they are so interconnected. And we talk about this empathic unsettlement, a term we borrow from Dominique Lacapra, who was my teacher, who is still my teacher, I would say, that we say if we bring them together, we somehow, difficult to say in our time, but still it's essential. It takes us each one a little bit out of his own narrative capsula, that he has to reach out to understand others and not emerge completely with his own narrative. It somehow destabilizes in a good way. It has a positive destructive element that opens the discourse of both sides to be changed, to exactly think this is exactly, and we use Khoury's literature quite a lot. This is exactly what Khoury meant. don't ossify on your own narrative. Find mechanism to open it to other possibilities, to other options, because otherwise you will be caught into it till it's a tragic end. So we both have to, and has a kind of a unsettlement, but in an empathic way, putting them together not just putting them together, we explain how, historically, culturally, and theoretically, even I would say psychologically. But it has a second phase, which Bashir called egalitarian binationalism. The outcome, as we explain, I will not explain it now, but we explain it in the book. The outcome should be it's not only a matter of history or culture or psychology or group psychology. It's about politics. And the outcome is what he coined, and we both use, we are egalitarian binationalism, which means we are so interconnected that we have to think about both. We are a binational unit in a way, but two nations that are combined, are intertwined in many ways, now also geographically. And we have to find egalitarian solution to this, which means it could take many shapes and forms, like one state, two states, not the Oslo state, two states envisioned, but two states or confederation. I mean, there are all kinds of political settings that we can think of, but the principles are that because we are intertwined and because there should be no supremacy whatsoever, certainly not Jewish supremacy whatsoever. Each group has to have its own complete within those frameworks, which are not against complete separation, but also complete conflation of the two parties. Both have to have full collective, individual, and civil rights, not as it is now that half of the population between the river and the sea has full rights and one doesn't have rights at all or only partial rights. So the outcome is a political agenda of what he calls egalitarian binationalism, that acknowledge two national groups that could not be completely separated, have to have some, even now we have to think about it. How can we live together, not separately, not like the symbol, this very vicious and brutal symbol of the wall of separation should be taken down, and in a way that we do not conflate into one another, but we are not completely disconnected, and we all have complete equal rights on all levels. So this is like the political outcome. Today, it's almost, I would say, science fiction to think along those lines, and even sometimes I feel it is obscene when the rivers of blood are flowing all over. But still, I think it can provide, even in a dialectical way of negating it, some kind of a framework or discursive framework to imagine and to create even small groups that discuss a complete different way of living together. Maybe 10, 20 years down the road, we will be more hopeful. Right now, you said, yeah, I'm not optimist, but I don't have hope right now. I can see hope, but I see obligation to continue this discourse. Even, it's a kind, I call it sumud to our humanity, to imagine some way of rehumanizing both sides. But I can't say more than that. And what I see that, if we become commercial, like very materialistic, the book is reprinted and reprinted because people look for some kind of this framework. Good people, not people that do want to think, to imagine, and to think politically different.
That was my experience as well. I 10 years ago now almost, I did my master's at the University of London at SOAS, and the topic of my master's was the politics of language. And as part of that, I looked at how Hebrew and Yiddish were used politically, or were talked about politically, especially when it comes to Zionism. You have a lot of the Bundists, of course, who were Yiddishists, and a lot of Zionists who were Hebraism, although it was much more complicated at times, but that was like part of the one person called Kulturkampf, like culture wars, basically, in Yiddish. And one of the things that led me down that path, because, as a Lebanese Palestinian, doing that sort of research is not exactly encouraged. And certainly was the topic of quite a few uncomfortable conversation at like family lunches and stuff. But the reason why I went down that path, or at least one of the reasons, is again to go back to James Bolton, because this is the podcast named after one of his books, because he is someone who, when interviewed a lot of times, was even accused by during the civil rights movement of like doing too much or trying too much to talk to white people or to try and convince white people or whatever. And the way he framed it is that he did not want their story of him to dominate his life. That's how he framed it. And so for me, if someone like him, who was the grandson of an actual enslaved person who can trace his lineage centuries to the past, very likely to the 1700s, if not 1800s, to conditions that are so horrific that most of us in the well, Gaza certainly is extremely horrific, but most of us who are not in Gaza cannot even fathom circumstances as horrible as like chattel slavery in the US. If someone like him with that legacy is still able, or was still able through a lot of struggle, and he talks about that a lot, of course, to not even just see the humanity in the oppressor, it's not even just that, but recognize that if he doesn't do that, he is the one who's at risk of being, well, to use Ilyas Khouri's term, ossified. And
can I say just brief
please,
word on this? You know, I think the first some of the major works in colonial, post-colonial, anti-colonial works talk precisely about that. How we are, despite the abyss between the the colonized and the colonizer, they are so much interconnected. Think of Fanon, black skin, white masks, or think of Homi Baba on the mimicry, and think of many others.
yeah,
We are interconnected so much, and vice both sides are we are mirroring in a very distorted way each other, and we influence each other, and we internalize and externalize each other. So we have to acknowledge that and work with it for the good, not for the bad.
and that was really the end of my thought anyway, in the sense that like
Yeah.
there has to be that work regardless of the conditions. And it does, I do understand, and I of course empathize with those who say like in Arabic, like "mish waqta," like now's not the time. And I get that. I definitely get that. It's just that functionally speaking, there's very rarely any time that could be said to be the right time. And if we're talking about a 70 plus, almost close to 80 years since the Nakba, for example, my grandfather was born and raised in Haifa and then exiled, and then he passed away a few years ago. At what point will there be time, right? And it just got to the point, at least as far as I'm concerned, where using, in many ways, cheating by using this particular medium of the podcast, which allows me, of course, to have these slow form, and people who want to engage also have to kind of make that effort to explore these things that wouldn't be as easy to do so, necessarily elsewhere. At least not as easy for me personally. So like that's part of
So
the intention in any case.
undoubtedly, I mean, I can't, as a descendant of a Nakba refugee, I can't tell you, look, this is what I can tell you with humility. This is how I suggest to move forward, to start. This is what I suggest. And if someone like you accepts it, I am honored and happy. And if not, I cannot truly understand it. And if someone in Gaza says it's obscene now, look, we need just stop the genocide, I can understand that, of course, as well. Nonetheless, I feel we should not abandon language altogether because silence is even a worse option.
It's really for me the whether I allow them, quote unquote, in this case, let's say the Israeli state, not so much the people, which is much messier category for me, who I'm not a big fan of nation states anyway. But in terms of governments, um, allowing them to dominate my story, or how what they determine should be my reaction, like because they're doing something that therefore this has to be the only correct reaction, with the caveat being that, of course, in cases like in Gaza, there is more than enough reason to hyper focus on just stopping the genocide. This is completely understandable.
Yeah.
But in my personal capacity as like someone who, in terms of stopping something like that, I can do my best, and I do, and I platform people, I talk to people, I share their stories. Ultimately, that's sort of the best I can do in terms of that. I see that there is this additional responsibility because I do have those resources, mentally speaking, especially because I'm not in such a situation, that like I try and do something with that. And I should say, as you mentioned yourself, there is a history to that. I'm not reinventing the wheel or anything like that here. Elias Khoury himself, of course, talked about this, but because he was born, for those who don't know, in 48, so he was born the year of the Nakba, and he in many ways grew up with that. But when we think of the big names of Palestinian literature or intellectual movements, whether it's Said, whether it's Mahmoud Darwish, whether it's even Kanafani, they understood this to various extent, that there has to be some kind of reckoning, not just because it's the right thing to do or whatever, because that's certainly that argument, but because there doesn't seem to be any other options anyway. Like this does seem to be like, at the very least, the discomfort that this causes can lead to some, to put it a bit poetically or whatever, like to different horizons than the ones that we're currently limited by. And at the very least, with such a platform as this one, which of course gives us a very privileged one in any case, gives us some of these tools to explore these things. And that's why I want also to have this conversation. But in terms of like final thoughts or anything, I want to give you the final words, basically, if you have anything to share.
I just second you. We should do, all our energies should be to stop the genocide. That's the number one. Whatever we can do, because this is part of our era, that we are powerless against those dark forces that erupted. But if we can also create some new words, in our subtitle of the Holocaust and the Nakba, the subtitle is New Grammar of Trauma and History, that may give some new spaces for discussion that are not to counter the discussions of the rhetoric of evil. I think this is also an obligation we should consider seriously.
On that note, Amos Goldberg, thank you a lot for being on the Fire These Times.
Thank you very much for having me, Elia.